I'm not just like the rest of you. I'm stronger. I'm smarter. I'm better. I am better.
Hello again, this is Preheat. Welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. Today we're going to be talking about Augmentation Evoker and patch 10.2. We're going to cover everything you need to know, so that's going to be Augmentation Evoker talents, best gear, preferred stats, best trinkets, consumables, how your tier 31 tier bonus in patch 10.2 works, who you should be buffing and when, how to do your opener, your rotation, and your cooldowns, and that's going to be for single target and AoE. But before we get started, let's talk about today's sponsor. Okay, so today's video doesn't actually have a sponsor, but have you heard about Medify? So basically it's this website you can use to get connected with experts in whatever game you're playing for one-on-one coaching. I'm actually one of the top mentors on Medify. My link is mfy.gg/@preheat. The link will be in the description below. Use promo code Preheat-101 to get 25% off your first lesson. So regardless of if you're coming back to the game and you just don't really have time to go watch guides on YouTube and read up on Wowhead, or if you already have a good sense for how to play, but you're just looking for something to give you that extra little edge, either way, we can have that one-on-one conversation and we can find areas where we can improve your play. Really, it's just about getting you to be the best evoker or mage possible. So again, definitely go check it out, mfy.gg/preheat. And don't forget to use discount code Preheat-101 for 25% off. All right, so let's talk about your raid talents as augmentation. So over here on the class side, you'll notice I have most of the throughput options. You can obviously pull out some of these talents if you need to pick up more utility, but I already have a lot of utility in this tree, so I feel like I don't really need to pick up anything more. But if you were to pull out a talent, the first ones that I would look at maybe to pull out, it'd be stuff like Ancient Flame or Innate Magic. This talent's actually pretty deceptive. It says it gives you essence regeneration at a faster rate, and that's true, but it doesn't really make that big of a difference overall. Also, you could pick up Enkindled instead of Innate Magic. Honestly, both of these talents are so minor that it really doesn't matter which one you choose, or if you even choose them at all. But make sure that you do not drop Natural Convergence, do not drop Scarlet Adaptation, also never drop Leaping Flames. Leaping Flames, even in single target, is extremely strong. Do not drop this talent. And then you can choose different options here. I picked Unravel because there's a lot of fights this tier where there's an Absorb Shield you need to break, but you could instead go for Protracted Talons, Oppressing Roar, it doesn't really matter. I don't pick up Regenerative Magic because Leech doesn't really do much for us as augmentation. We don't really do damage, we don't really heal people all that much. So it's kind of moot, but make sure you have your defensives, right? All of these other ones are locked in. If you have healers all with the Source of Magic buff already, so yours is just extra, you could definitely drop Source of Magic and Potent Mana. And you could also drop Rescue and Twin Guardian if you wanted to. Time Spiral is also one you could drop, but I wouldn't really recommend doing that because Time Spiral in raid at least has a lot of value. One thing I really like to do with Rescue and Twin Guardian, by the way, the duration of this is actually increased as augmentation, so it's like even better than what it normally is. But I actually make a macro for my raiders who maybe have a little bit more trouble moving around, so like Priest, Warlock, stuff like that. And I will actually try to stand on top of that person and then press my macro, which will move me and that person to where my cursor is. Always try to do it like right in front of that person so that they don't get flipped around. But this will give you and your ally a huge Absorb Shield for 30% of your health, and it lasts for 6.4 seconds, increased because of our mastery. And this can actually save people's lives. So anytime there's a knockback, anytime there's something where, you know, it looks like your players, they have to make a big move and maybe some people are a little disadvantaged, like Priest, right? They have small legs. Yeah, give them the Rescue. Just make sure that you don't accidentally kill your ally. And if you want the macro that I use to instantly move you and the target that you hard code into that macro whenever you press the button, it'll be in the description below, so definitely go check that out. On the augmentation side of things, this is the general raid build I would recommend. There are some variations here though. So if it's pure single target, you can definitely drop Pupil of Alexstrasza for Echoing Strike. This is only nice though if you actually press Azure Strike, but for me, if I ever need to make like a micro adjustment and I just need like one global to move my character, I will use Echoing Strike. You can actually cross a lot of distance with your one global as augmentation evoker because you can double tap your spacebar as you do your global and your character will run at basically 170% move speed. So that's pretty great. But yeah, Echoing Strike just makes it so that there's a 10% chance whenever I throw out that semi-useless Azure Strike that I have it double, and then that's a double chance added at an Essence Burst. So we like that talent. Also, my healers always ask for Spatial Paradox, so I just locked this talent in. But if you weren't running Spatial Paradox, what you could run instead is your Regenerative Chitin talent. This thing is nice because it means that you don't have to really worry about the tank and their Blistering Scales. You can just kind of put it on them and forget about them. But most of the time, my healers are going to ask for this talent anyway, so I don't really run it. And then for Mythic Smolderon, I think it's actually worthwhile to drop Interwoven Threads and pick up Plot the Future and play with Time Skip. The reason why is because if you use Time Skip right after your first Breath of Aeons during the damage amp, you'll be able to use your breath again at about 1.5 minutes into the fight from that point. And then you can actually use Time Skip again before your third breath, which is usually where the raid uses Bloodlust and everything. So it will basically line up your first 3 Breath of Aeons in that fight so that you get it during the damage amp. And if you don't have this talent, it won't line up with Lust very easily. So this is just kind of like something that I have been trying out. If you want to have all 3 of your first breaths line up really well, pick this talent. But generally speaking, Threads is just better. So it's up to you if you want to experiment with that. I think it's pretty good on Smolderon, and I would not do it anywhere else. When it comes to Mythic Plus, I'm going to run something kind of like this. And keep in mind, on the utility side of things, you can obviously move stuff around as you need to. But if you're ever playing with a Demon Hunter tank, make sure that you have a Pressing Roar. This thing is so insane with their Silent Sigil. So how this works is basically it increases any sort of CC as long as you use it before the crowd control is applied. And silence is a form of crowd control. So if you get to the pack of casters and you hit it with the Oppressing Roar right before the sigil blows up on the ground, it's a little blue one, they'll actually be silenced for around 10 seconds, I think. And it also increases the duration of other crowd control too. It doesn't consume it. It stays up for 10 seconds. This thing is just absolutely bonkers in Mythic Plus, especially since there's so many packs that just have so many really, really bad casts. And it also allows the tank to get things grouped way easier. So I'm a big fan of Oppressing Roar. I've been using this in pretty much every dungeon I run, especially if there's a Demon Hunter tank. And then obviously like having a stun is nice with Terror of the Skies. We like that talent. I actually went to innate magic so I could pick up Clobbering Sweep here. This is nice as another stop, but it's not necessary. Like you could definitely drop these talents and instead maybe pick up Rescue and the Rescue Shield. It's just if I'm playing with pugs, then I usually don't like to use Rescue just because people will sometimes complain. Even if a Rescue is completely fine, they'll just complain about it anyways. And then Sleepwalk is nice. It can be used as a stop on pretty much anything. It doesn't have any sort of special requirements on it. Just as long as the mob can be crowd controlled, this will work. So you can use it as like an individual stop. You can also use it to remove really nasty casters from a pack. We used that a lot in last season, especially for the apparatus in Halls of Infusion, because they just do this channel attack over and over and over again that just destroys you on high keys. So Sleepwalk is really nice. I would never get rid of Cauterizing Flame, but I could definitely see myself dropping Sleepwalk. But yeah, experiment with what feels good to you. This is just kind of what I recommend. And then on the augmentation side, make sure that you pick up Imposing Presence for Mythic Plus. This is going to make your interrupt much faster. And then what we end up dropping is usually Stretch Time, Spatial Paradox. These ones are nice to have, but they don't really fit into Mythic Plus builds because we have to pick up Imposing Presence. So yeah, just know it's a little sketchy not having Stretch Time, especially since you're using Breath of Aeons a lot. Really dangerous parts of the fight. So if your Defy Fate isn't up, good luck with that. Just be really careful. And whenever it comes to Molten Blood, this talent actually was nerfed 50% in the patch. So it's not anywhere near as good as it used to be, but it can still be useful, especially like on tyrannical weeks if you need just like a little bit more of a defensive to keep your allies alive. That being said, though, there is a different version of this build that I've been using that I like a lot, and I'm going to recommend it here. I know a lot of people have been kind of experimenting with new things. So the rationale for this build is they nerfed augmentation damage by about 10% in the last set of nerfs right before the patch, but they did not adjust the damage of your Blistering Scales. So in a way, Blistering Scales damage is actually higher than it used to be if you're talking comparatively. So what I do is I run Reactive Hide instead of Inferno's Blessing. So dropping these talents like a 4% damage decrease, but then we pick up this Reactive Hide talent, which is going to make our Blistering Scales do double damage. Double damage means that the tank is getting more threat. And also, since I'm using this, I'm also using Regenerative Chitin because I just want to keep my my shield on the tank the entire time. I found that playing with this setup here allows tanks to have more threat. It allows tanks to just see their damage breakdown. You'll notice that Blistering Scales is doing like 20-30% of their damage sometimes, depending on the dungeon. And I don't really have to recast Blistering Scales ever if I do this, except for in Throne of Tides. Sometimes I have to do that, but usually it'll literally go all the way to the duration and then fall off. So it's just a nice quality of life thing. It helps tanks keep aggro better. It deals great damage, so I just don't really see any downside to it. Definitely enjoying this build, and I just kind of lock this in for every Mythic Plus I do. But obviously, if I were to move some stuff around, if I had another Evoker in the group, or if my healer didn't care about their source of magic, I could pull those talents out. I could pick up Rescue and Twin Guardian, and then I'd probably be pretty happy with the setup right here. Okay, so the idea with augmentation is you are buffing your allies, and a lot of your damage comes from your allies. In fact, the majority of the damage comes from your allies. So Ebon Might is kind of your main buff, and this is what you're trying to keep up on your allies. It can be extended by using your empowers and also your eruptions. It also gets 5 seconds whenever you use Breath of Aeons. So our primary stat needs to be as high as possible. That way we are giving our allies more stats whenever we put that out. But this is always going to go to your closest allies, although you can mark allies to have Ebon Might forced onto them. So that's going to be Prescience. That is why we use this ability. It's basically a buff that we put out. It gives people a little crit, get a little bit of their damage copied. But the main reason why we're using this is just to mark them as a good target for Ebon Might. This is especially useful in Raid. In Mythic Plus, you're always just going to be buffing your whole party, so it doesn't really matter. But in Raid, you want to be putting Prescience on the right people. And then Breath of Aeons, this is kind of like our 2-minute cooldown. You could think of it that way. We basically apply these temporal wounds to our target, and then our target's going to accumulate damage and then eventually pop. And that damage is decent. So we want to kind of line this up with all of our other buffs. We want to multiply everything as much as possible. That's the whole point. We're force multiplying our allies' damage, so we want to catch them when they're at their peak, and we want to also load up all of our buffs on our allies. But essentially, yeah, you just put this thing out roughly every 2 minutes. Try to line up with your allies' burst as much as possible. And then Eruption is going to be how we kind of extend our buffs naturally. This and our 2 Empower spells, which are going to be Fire Breath and Upheaval. And then while we're not using our buffs and extending our buffs, we need to be building. So building is going to be done through either Living Flame, which is just our generic ability. You throw out like a little bolt of fire. It can proc Essence Bursts. Or it's going to be done through Azure Strike. This one we don't really use too much. It can be okay as like a slow. It's instant cast, but generally speaking, you want to be casting Living Flame, not Azure Strike. And then Fire Breath. So the more you charge up this ability, the more it shifts the damage from the damage over time to the upfront. Since it's an Empower ability, you can charge it. Try to always charge this as much as possible, but if you need to bail, if there's something in your feed or like something that you're in danger of, the fight's just too hectic, just send it. You can use that at level 1. It's not a big deal. Just know that the value of this, the reason why we're trying to charge it up is because of our Leaping Flames buff. That's our talent where we get more Living Flame. It basically makes it like a shotgun. It makes us proc more Essence Burst. That's why we want to charge Fire Breath up whenever we can. And then our other Empower spell is Upheaval. This one, the more you charge it up, the bigger the circle is. That's all that really changes. So generally speaking, you just want to send this at whatever level is the minimum, so that it hits all of the targets. And then whenever it comes to our actual stats, so Mastery is going to make it so that our all of our buffs are increased, which is fantastic. More uptime equals more damage. And then also we have something called Shifting Sands. So Shifting Sands is going to give our allies a Versatility buff. The potency of that Versatility buff and the duration are based off of how much Mastery we have. So because this is so stacked, we want to just have like as much Mastery as possible. Mastery is by far our best secondary stat. We want to stack it basically to the moon. And even if you're like above like 9,000 Mastery is still probably your best stat. And then Sands of Time, this is basically how we get those extensions. So like I said before, Eruption extends your buffs. Using your empowered abilities, that's Fire Breath and Upheaval, that extends your buffs. Breath of Aeons also gives you 5 seconds. And of course, the targets that you are getting the damage accumulation from, those are the targets that you buffed with Ebon Might. So if you don't already have an Ebon Might out, Breath of Aeons will automatically pick 4 targets to put that on. And then this can actually critically strike. So your crit stat isn't completely useless. Whenever we have that crit roll, it can roll to increase the duration of the extension by an additional 50%. So that's nice. But overall, crit and haste, although they do technically increase our duration of our buffs, we don't really care about them too much. We mainly just want to focus on intelligence, and then mastery is pretty good too. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into each and every little ability. You can always just mouse over them in game and read what they do. I covered the important ones, but if you want to know more, just go check out the Wowhead guide, read what the abilities do there, and let's move on to the stats. Okay, so when it comes to gearing, a lot of it is informed by our stats, like I mentioned. So you can see here above me, my mastery is very high. I've got 9,000 mastery. Just know that mastery is still my best stat, even though it's this high up. And I'm getting those diminished returns. Basically, I'm only getting 70% of the value per point. because my mastery is just so high at this point. But yeah, so when it comes to our critical strike, our haste, I try to keep these relatively even. You notice they're both at about the same rating here. So like 2,800, 2,600. It's not super important that they stay this way. I just like them to be about even. But obviously for you, you know, decide what you would like to prefer there. And then versatility doesn't really do much for us, so I try to avoid versatility. And then when it comes to our other stats, obviously avoidance is really great for Mythic Plus, Raid, just like everything in general. Leech doesn't really do much for us at all. Speed is nice, but yeah, mainly you want to focus on avoidance. And then obviously intelligence is the most important thing here, because this is our Ebb and Might. This is where a lot of our damage comes from our buffs. So yeah, try to have your intellect as high as possible. When it comes to our tier bonus, so I'm going to go for helmet, shoulders, chest, and gloves. The reason why I'm going for these is because, actually 2 reasons. So number 1, the pants tier do not have any mastery on them. So that's not great. And reason number 2 is that I actually want to use this embellish item, the ally leggings of the Khans. So these actually give you and your allies a slight verse buff. This item is slightly overtuned. The damage isn't going to come back to you in any way, so it doesn't show up in logs or anything. But I know it's happening. I know it's good. They've got mastery on them, so I love them. But if you aren't able to slot in these pants because part of your 4-piece bonus is pants, you know, it's not a huge deal. You could instead go for the acidic treads. These are pretty nice. They do like decent single target. They've got mastery on them. Just know that they don't really do much in AoE, but it's an okay option there. And then for your other embellishment, this is one that I recommend for all augmentation evokers. Try to get yourself the adaptive bracers. Those are going to be great for devastation, for preservation, for augmentation. Doesn't matter. They're just generally good. Try to get your bracers. And then when it comes to everything else, you kind of just want to go for the highest int possible with hopefully some mastery. Keep in mind that jewelry does not have any intelligence on it. So my necklace, I don't care about the item level. I just care about the stats. And this is the neck off of Tendril Sage Swift. It is absolutely insane. Look at how much mastery this thing has. So this is by far our best in slot neck. However, if you don't have the access to raid, you can always pick up the Chain of Green Flight from Darkheart Thicket. This neck isn't terrible, but I would definitely recommend trying to get the one from raid if you can get your hands on that. It's a much bigger increase. I mean, just look at the distribution here, right? It's got so little haste. Almost all of the stats are on mastery. It's a fantastic neck. And then whenever it comes to rings, you're going to want the ring from Darkheart Thicket, the Archdruid Tainted Seal. This thing has high mastery. It's great. And then for the other ring, I have a crafted one because now we have our 3rd spark this week. However, if you don't have access to this ring and you still have the old ring from the previous raid, that's going to be the Entropic Convergence Loop. This thing right here, 447. Look at the mastery on this thing. It's absolutely insane, especially if you have a socket on it. So this ring is actually best in slot as long as you don't have access to the crafted one. I would wait to replace this ring with the crafted option, and I wouldn't really replace it with anything else in the meantime. You can also go even back another tier to the Seal of Filial Duty. It's okay. It's got a little shield on it. Just know that you're dropping a lot of stamina going this low on item level. It's not going to really affect your damage, but it will affect your health points. So I would definitely say like the crafted ring seems like the best option here. Also, you can have like the well-fed bonus on it, the little flavor pocket. So that whenever you die, you keep your food buff, which is really nice. I definitely recommend that. And then whenever it comes to other items, so generally speaking, you're going to want like the boots from Darkheart Thicket. Those are really great. There's a cape from Raid that you can pick up. I don't have it, but it's high mastery. And then for your weapon, it's probably going to be just whatever has the highest item level, because you just want to have like the highest int possible. Obviously, special weapons are even better though. So like Vakash off of the last boss is a really, really great mace. And it can definitely be better even if it's lower item level just because of the proc on it, which is fantastic. We also have the staff off of Nemu, which is great. It gives us just a little extra damage. And then you can also go to Dawn of the Infinite and pick up the Iridel. This staff is great, but you will have to actually cast it, and it doesn't really have mastery on it. So yeah, really it's just up to item level, I'd say, more so than anything else. But you know, keep in mind that special weapons, which there are a lot of them this tier, they might just beat out what you have. Also, if you have the legendary from previous tier, it's probably going to stay best in slot for you until you have a weapon that's about 480, or like a weapon offhand combination that's around 480 equivalent, just because that weapon's actually really, really good. But you will replace it in this tier, and I've already replaced mine, and a lot of other people I know have replaced theirs. So yeah, just keep in mind the legendary is not going to stick around forever. And then whenever it comes to your trinkets, so great options are going to be like the Belarus trinket. This thing you kind of want to just use on cooldown. It does great damage. It's a little overtuned when it comes to the amount of damage it puts out, and it gives you Intellect on it, so it's fantastic. You can also fit this trinket inside of a global, so whenever you do an instant cast, immediately use the trinket, and that way it overlaps and you get a little bit of the value is added there because the cast time isn't technically as long because you're spending some of the cast time in a global cooldown. And then Balefire Branch is probably going to be your best in slot, although it can depend because if you take damage, this thing can be removed. You typically want to use this with your Breath of Aeons. So the proper use is like you're doing Breath of Aeons, and then as you land, you use the trinket. That way it juices your Intellect, and it will actually dynamically update your Intellect. So your Ebon will dynamically update for your allies, even though you just finished your breath. Also, other good trinkets. So you can go with the Unraveling Spindle. This thing is pretty great. The way I would use the Spindle is I would use it between when you use Ebon Might and before you use your Breath of Aeons. So since it's 2 minute, I would just kind of like throw out my Ebon Might, throw out my Prescience targets, use my Spindle, then use Breath of Aeons. That's generally the way to go about it. But obviously, if you're using double on use, which is best this tier, it's going to be a little awkward, right? Because there's a lot of different combinations you could end up using. So if I was using Branch and Spindle, I would probably on the pull use my Branch with Breath, and then I would use my Spindle afterwards, and then I would probably try to just use my Balefire Branch on cooldown, kind of offset it from my Spindle, and then probably just send my Spindle right before my Breath every time. The reason why you'd want to do it before Breath is because whenever you use Spindle, it's going to give you a huge mastery increase whenever those buffs come back, and then whenever you use your Empowers, which you're buffing your friends who you're putting out the breath for, right? You're going to give them a lot more versatility because your mastery is going to be like 3,000 higher. So they're going to have an increased damage window during their Breath of Aeons. That's the whole point of this. If you have other trinkets though, I mean, it's kind of the same logic, right? Like if it's an on-use, just try to amp up your Breath of Aeons. And just know that when it comes to other trinkets, like passive trinkets, there are some pretty good options out there. So double on use is the best, but if you don't want to go for that, Pips is a decent alternative. You can get this one off of Council of Dreams. It's all right. Also, the trinket off of Smolderon, it's a use trinket, but this one's okay. You can use this right after Breath of Aeons, like we talked about. And then whenever it comes to dungeon trinkets, if you're talking about one that's a passive trinket that we wouldn't have to use, the Vessel's probably the best of your options here, just because it has Intellect on it. You can go with other trinkets too. Just not a huge deal, but I mean, generally speaking, like you want your trinket to either have int on it or you want it to grant you intelligence whenever you press the button. So as a general rule for gearing, I actually like to use this tool called Pawn. If you've been playing World of Warcraft forever, you probably have heard of this thing. We used to use this way back in the day before Sims. The reason why I recommend this for augmentation is because augmentation, you can't really easily sim it. So it's the only class I would recommend Pawn for. Do not use Pawn for any other class, but what you want to do is open up Pawn and you want to click manual here. And then I have a couple strings. I'm going to be including these in the description below if you want to grab them. But I've basically got 3 different versions of this string here. And it just depends on where your mastery is at, on which one you're going to use. So if your mastery is above this number, use this one. So in my case, my mastery is at like 9,100. So I'm going to grab this top one. And then over here, I'm going to click import. I'm going to paste this in. And then I'm going to make this a different color than the others. And that way I know which one to actually trust. So like over here, like let's say I'm using my old ring, right? So if I take this old ring and I compare it against the crafted one, like so, you'll notice here that the red one says 15% upgrade. I'm just going to trust that for what my upgrade is. Keep in mind though that Pawn is not going to look at trinkets. It's not going to look at any sort of special effects. It won't look at embellishments. It won't look at like special effects on your weapon. It's strictly looking at your stats. So always take Pawn with like a gigantic grain of salt. But it can be pretty good for knowing if an item is an upgrade if you're just comparing like apples to apples. For enchants and consumables, all that stuff, I recommend this stuff right here. Pause the video if you need to see it, but basically it's like your file of Corrupting Rage will deal damage to you. It's technically your best file. All the rest of them are kind of whatever. I mean, you can go Verse if you need to have damage reduction. You can go the Elemental Chaos if you don't want to be taking damage. But Corrupting Rage is kind of going to be what you want to go with. And then for healing potions, it kind of just depends on how much you need to heal. The Withering Dreams is actually really nice, but it will apply damage over time to you. And then for gems, you have 1 skillful, and then the other 2, I would just go with whatever your lowest secondary stat is. So crit if your crit's lower, haste if your haste is lower. Okay, let's talk about the patch 10.2 tier bonus. So this is the tier 31 tier from season 3 of Dragonflight. The 2-piece bonus is going to make it so every 3rd Prescience lasts twice as long. There's not really a good way to track this, but what I generally do is whenever I die in raid and I take a res, I just immediately throw out 2 Prescience. That way I'm locked and loaded on that third one, ready to go. And then the 4-piece bonus is where a lot of the strength of this bonus is. So whenever we cast a Prescience, it makes it so that our next eruption is going to have little fissures, and you can actually see it in the spell animation. You have more of them. These buffs are just going to give us more uptime on Ebon Might, and it makes us do slightly more damage. There's really not all that much to it. You don't really need to track it. Just know that it's giving you more damage, more uptime, and it's pretty strong. So I'm going to stitch in the part from a previous video. If you want to watch the full thing, just click up there on the info card. But essentially the idea is because of this tier bonus, we're able to have out 4 Prescience sometimes. So right now you see 3. I'm about to apply a 4th one. And there's a slight window where I'm able to have all 4 out. I can get my Ebon Might out, and then I can choose those targets for my Ebon Might. That's the whole idea with this, is that you're basically getting to choose the correct targets. If you want this voodoo setup, there's also another video you can check out, link up there. It'll also be in the description if you want to get this exact setup. But the idea is just that like there's these slight windows where we have all 4 targets chosen. We want to be buffing the same targets as the other Augmentation Evoker if they're in the raid, because you can stack 2 of those buffs together, but it's going to kind of look like this. So combat begins, you throw out your 2 Prescience, and then if you were to just use it exactly on cooldown, which I don't really recommend, but if you were to, this is how they kind of line up. So you can see here we have 3 Prescience out, and now there's a slight window here where there's a 4th, right? And basically these little windows where we have that 4th target, they're just going to happen throughout combat. That's going to be generally where you want to use your Ebon Might again to re-up it. But the way I like to play it is, since we have 2 charges of Prescience, I just throw out both of them on the pole. I try to get those 2 out, and then I'm just going to use Prescience whenever I'm about to cap out on my Prescience charges, or if I'm about to use Ebon Might. That way, right before Ebon Might, usually I'll be throwing out 2 Prescience last second, and then I'll have 4 targets pretty much guaranteed for every lineup. And then here's a kind of a diagram of what this looks like in Premiere. But as you can see, those slight windows where we have the 4 overlap, they do happen, and this is just sitting on cooldown. This you can obviously play it a lot better if you don't sit on cooldown. If you hold your Prescience but just don't cap at 2, it makes it a lot easier to find these little windows where you can have 4 people. And if you're just buffing 3, then you can always just stand on top of the person that you want to buff as your 4th. Generally, that person that you're buffing would be like a BM Hunter, since they're really strong right now. But obviously, that's going to change with balance. Blizzard's doing a lot of balancing right now, so the best classes to buff will probably be different depending on when you watch this video in the patch. But just as like a general rule, the best classes to buff right now are Assassination Rogues, BM Hunters, Demon Hunters, Enhancement Shaman, and then other classes that are like decent to buff. Just anyone who's getting PI, anyone's high burst, people who have their damage last a while. Devastation Evoker honestly is a good one, although they're a bit undertuned. But yeah, that's a general rule. Just try to buff whoever's topping on the meters. Okay, so in terms of how you actually play Augmentation, I just ran a random pug to show this, but before combat, you obviously want to get your buffs out. So that's Blessing of the Bronze on the group. Obviously, put out your Blistering Scales on whichever tank you think needs it most. So that's going to be like Brewmaster, Blood Decay. That's good for those classes. Also, if there's 2 Evokers, just buff both tanks. Put out your Source of Magic on the healer. I've already identified who I think are the best targets to buff up, so I'm going to use them. I'm going to precast my Living Flame. I'm going to throw out my 2 buffs, just like so. And then we're going to use Ebon Might here, tip the scales into Fire Breath, and then use Upheaval. And then I'm going to use Breath of Aeons, use my Trinket Potion, and then just start spamming Eruptions. And you'll notice here, I'm not going to use this Prescience. I'm going to wait. The reason why I'm waiting there is because I want to make sure that I have 2 charges in just a little bit. So we're going to be buffing some people right here. Go ahead and throw out these 2 buffs. And we go back to Eruption spam. And I'm kind of just biding my time right now until it's time for us to like use our next Ebon Might. Go ahead and use this Fire Breath, use this Upheaval, and use my Trinket while I'm at it too. And then, okay, so right here, I'm about to use my next Ebon Might. I have a little bit left, so I'm going to throw out my 2 Prescience, 1, 2, and then begin my Ebon Might casts. It's going to buff my people I chose to move for a cone there. And then back to just Eruption spam. And you notice the cadence of that, right? We basically use our 2 Eruptions right before. I'm going to have to bail on this one so I don't get hit. We use it right before we use our Ebon Might. And right here, I'm going to charge up this Eruption since we're hitting multiple targets. Throw out 1 Prescience there too. And then we're going to have a little bit downtime here because I don't have my next Ebon Might for a while. So I'm just going to spam Living Flames for a little bit. I'm going to buff up my Demon Hunter friend. It looks like he just went out of range of me. Classic. I'll buff the Warrior instead. And I'll throw out the Ebon Might. And now, since I have my 4 targets, these are my preferred targets. Use my Empower as soon as it comes up, just like so. And now it's intermission time. So yeah, that's the gist of it. I mean, you're kind of just trying to keep your buffs up as much as possible. During this intermission, the boss isn't going to take damage, so I'm not really going to worry about buffing people. I'm just going to do the mechanics here. But essentially the idea is just you want to spend all of your essence whenever you have Ebon Might up. And if you don't have Ebon Might up, you are kind of just like waiting. You're just trying to get procs. So like right here, I could just be throwing out Living Flames, just trying to get some procs while the roots go. We'll go ahead and buff out a couple people here. Also, while we wait, and the last root goes, so I want to get my Ebon Might out, tip the scales of my Fire Breath, throw out my Breath of Aeon since this is a damage amp, use my branch, trinket, and then continue. Using my Eruption, we'll draw the Living Flame to get the Leaping Flames. Didn't proc, that's unlucky. You hate to see it. And then Prescience is coming up here, so I'm going to go ahead and buff my Demon Hunter friend. And the boss is dead. There it is. So yeah, the basics are just put your buffs out before combat. Try and identify who your best targets to buff are. If you want my UI, obviously go download it. It's the Voodoo one from that video. Just go check that out. It has Omni CD on the right, so you can kind of see when people's cooldowns are coming up soon. And then try to have 4 Prescience out whenever you use Ebon Might, or try to be on top of someone you want to buff. Usually that person would be like a Beam Hunter. There are some things you can do for that though. Like you can try to only have the people within 100 yards of you be the people you want to buff, and then use a Wyvern Stone to fly in. I don't really recommend doing that. It's a lot of work. A lot of min-maxing for very little. But yeah, I mean, the gist of it is just do not spend Essence Burst. Do not send your Empowers. Use all of that stuff only whenever Ebon Might is out. And that way you're always getting the maximum extensions. You're just trying to keep your Ebon Might up for as long as possible. And the rotation in single target and AoE, it's exactly the same. Nothing changes. The only difference would just be that you would make your Eruption bigger because you'd be hitting more enemies. That's really all there is to it. So again, the cooldowns that we care about, number 1 is going to be Ebon Might. This is our bread and butter. We always want to have this out, and preferably on the targets. They're actually going to give us damage. It's where a lot of our damage comes from, so it's pretty important. We have Prescience. It's a short cooldown. It has 2 charges. Use this to manage who you put your Ebon Might on. We also have Breath of Aeons, which we want to kind of use as like a 2-minute. We want to use that with our burst. So whenever people are at like the peak of their burst, that's where the window comes out. That's where we want to be buffing them. And obviously having like our Shifting Sands on them from our other 2 cooldowns, which are like Upheaval and Fire Breath, our 2 Empower spells. That's also really important for this. And then the only other cooldown really is like Fury of the Aspects, but that's Bloodlust. You don't really get to choose when this happens unless you do it on accident. People will probably be mad at you if you do that. Everyone gets haste from it, and it does make you unable to receive it for 10 minutes after you press it. So it's kind of like a group cooldown, I guess you could say. But that's the gist of it, right? In single target AoE, nothing changes. Our Eruption is our spender, and it just automatically does more damage the more targets there are. We don't change what builder we use in AoE. It's exactly the same. The only thing that would change in AoE is just like thinking about exactly when we want to buff and who we want to buff, because the classes that are best on the pole may not necessarily be the best classes, like a minute in, or especially if there's like a bunch of AoE that's happening, right? So I'll give you an example. Arcane Mage on the pole is pretty good. Unholy DK with PI, pretty good. After that though, terrible. You don't want to buff them again, right? Only whenever they're at the peak of their damage. If there's any AoE happening, Demon Hunters can be really, really good to buff. Enhancement 2, it just kind of depends on how many targets. You're really just looking for like whoever is going to be topping during that like 40-second window. That's who's important to be buffing. But yeah, anyways, that is all there really is to it. All right, and that's going to be it for today. So if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more of my content, be sure to subscribe to the channel, ring that notification bell, and hopefully I see you in the next one.